My daughter-in-law whispered to my son, "Tell the waiter to get this pauper away from our table. It's so embarrassing." They had no idea that the luxurious life they were living was being paid for by my secret fortune. They called me a pauper, so I decided to buy the entire restaurant just to teach them the true price of their arrogance. The restaurant was the kind of place where the silence had a price tag. You could hear the discreet clink of heavy silverware on porcelain and the low murmur of conversations that never rose above a confident hum. It was my son Robert's favorite new spot, a place that screamed success, which was precisely why we were there. He'd just been made a vice president at his firm, and this dinner was meant to be the coronation. I looked at him across the table, his face flushed with triumph, and told him how immensely proud I was. He gave a quick nod, his attention already shifting to my daughter-in-law Catherine, who was detailing the new luxury SUV his promotion would finally allow them to purchase. I smoothed the front of my simple wool dress, the one my late husband George had always said brought out the color of my eyes. It was clean, perfectly pressed, and in this sea of glittering designer labels, it felt like a homespun raft in the middle of the ocean. Catherine was wearing a black dress that was probably worth more than my entire wardrobe, her diamonds catching the low light and scattering it across the table. She was the queen of this court, and Robert was her triumphant king. I was, I suppose, the visiting dignitary from a forgotten land. I tried to join in sharing a story about how Robert used to dream of being a pilot when he was a little boy. Catherine smiled a tight, polite expression that didn't reach her eyes and commented on how quaint that was. Robert was busy trying to flag down the sommelier, his hand raised just a little too high, a gesture of someone trying to prove they belonged. I fell silent watching them. They didn't talk about the work, the achievement, or the years of effort. They talked about the things it would buy, the status it conferred, the vacations it would unlock. It was a language of assets and appearances, and I found I had very little to contribute. Just as the appetizers arrived, my old flip phone vibrated in my purse. It was a quiet, insistent buzz. I glanced at the screen, saw the name, and knew I had to take it. I quietly excused myself, sensing Catherine's flash of annoyance that I was disrupting the performance. I walked toward the lobby, my sensible shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. "Everything is on schedule, Eleanor," a familiar voice said on the other end. I listened for a moment, my back to the dining room, watching the perfectly dressed patrons coming and going. "Good," I said softly. "There are no complications." "None. The final pieces are moving into place. We can proceed with the acquisition on your signal." "Thank you, David," I said. "Maintain the course. I'll be in touch." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my purse. When I returned to the table, Robert was mid-sentence, talking about a golf membership. He paused, looking at me with a hint of impatience. I offered a small smile and explained that it was just my financial advisor making sure everything was in order. Catherine shot a look at Robert, a tiny smirk that communicated a whole volume of condescension, as if my finances were a small pension account she had to humor. The rest of the dinner passed in a similar vein. I ate my sea bass, listened to their plans, and felt a growing sense of distance, a quiet ache for my George, who would have found all of this so ridiculous. Finally, as the dessert menus were being presented, I decided to excuse myself to the ladies' room. I pushed my chair back quietly and started to walk away. I was only a few feet from the table, not yet out of earshot, when the performance stopped and the truth came out. It was Catherine's voice, a venomous hiss that cut through the restaurant's expensive silence. "Can you believe she wore that?" she said, the disgust clear and sharp. Then her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, one I was never meant to hear, but will never be able to forget. "For God's sake, Robert, tell the waiter to get this pauper away from our table. It's embarrassing." For 2 days, those words echoed in the quiet of my home. Get this pauper away from our table. It was a cruel, casual sentence tossed out like a piece of trash. but it didn't break me. It did something else entirely. It clarified everything. The years of small slights, the condescending smiles, the conversations that stopped when I entered a room, they weren't just thoughtless. They were symptoms of a deep, rot-like contempt. In the cold silence of my house, I didn't cry. I felt a lifetime of patient love curdle into something hard, clear, and focused. I finally understood what needed to be done. The first tremor happened on a Tuesday. I knew Catherine's shopping schedule. I pictured her in some gleaming, overpriced boutique, holding a silk blouse, her voice dripping with condescension as she spoke to the sales clerk. And then, the moment of truth. The declined card. The polite professional smile of the cashier that doesn't quite hide the pity. I imagined her face, the confusion turning to indignant fury. I could almost hear the frantic stabbing pokes of her finger on her phone as she called Robert. It didn't take long. Less than an hour later, their luxury SUV screeched to a halt in my driveway. The doorbell didn't chime. A fist hammered against the wood. When I opened the door, they pushed past me into my small living room, their frantic energy a stark violation of the peace I cultivated there. Catherine's face was a mask of outrage, and Robert looked like a man who had just been told the sky was falling. He told me there was a problem with the trust, a terrible mistake. He said the bank had frozen all their funds and that I needed to call them immediately to sort it out. I let him finish his panicked tirade, his voice bouncing off the floral wallpaper. When he was done gasping for breath, I walked to my kitchen and put the kettle on for tea. I asked if they wanted any. The question seemed to short-circuit Robert's brain. He sputtered that he did not want tea. He wanted me to fix this. I turned from the counter, my hands steady, and looked my son in the eye. I told him there was no need to call the bank. There was no mistake. I explained that as the sole overriding trustee of the Vance Family Trust, I had suspended all disbursements. Silence. It was a heavy, shocked silence completely different from the expensive quiet of the restaurant. Catherine was the first to find her voice accusing me of being senile, of being cruel. Robert, recovering, pulled out his phone and started frantically scrolling, insisting his father had set up the trust to provide for them. He said I had no right. I walked over to my little roll-top desk and pulled out a worn leather folder. Inside was a copy of the trust document. I opened it to page 7, section 3, and handed it to him. I told him to read the clause his father and I had put in 30 years ago, the one specifying that in the event of my husband's passing, sole and absolute discretionary power reverted to me. It was there to protect the family legacy from foolishness or greed. I told him their lifestyle had become a threat to that legacy. They stared at the paper, then at me as if seeing me for the first time. The anger was still there, but beneath it was a flicker of something new, confusion. They left not with a bang, but with a bewildered, stumbling retreat. They had come in like lions and were leaving like drenched cats. As their car sped away, I sat in my favorite armchair and picked up the phone. I didn't feel a rush of victory, just the quiet satisfaction of a necessary task completed. "David," I said when he answered. "It's Eleanor." I told him about the visit, my voice even and calm. I said their reaction was exactly what we had anticipated. I instructed him that there was no need to wait any longer. I told him to accelerate the final acquisition, all of it. He confirmed he would, and we ended the call. I sat there for a long time as the sun set, the last light casting long shadows across my living room. I thought about the look on Robert's face as he'd left. The anger was a mask, but for a second I saw past it. I saw fear. It was the dawning fear of a man who suddenly realizes the ground beneath his feet isn't solid rock, and the quiet, unassuming woman he called his mother was a stranger holding the map. The silence that followed their first retreat was heavy with unspoken threats. I knew my son, and I knew his wife even better. Their entire world was built on a foundation of other people's money and opinions, and I had just kicked out the cornerstone. They wouldn't let it go. I simply waited, watering my hydrangeas and drinking my afternoon tea, knowing the wolves were regrouping just out of sight. The first volley was predictably a letter. It arrived by courier, thick and self-important, from a law firm with a name so long it took up 3 lines on the letterhead. It was full of legal jargon, veiled threats, and demands. It spoke of filial duty and hinted at questioning my competency. I read it over a biscuit, took a calm sip of my tea, and placed it in the drawer with my old utility bills. It was exactly what I expected: a show of force from a position of profound weakness. When the letter failed to produce a panicked response, they moved on to phase 2, emotional manipulation. They arrived at my door a few days later, not with fury, but with a bouquet of lilies that must have cost a fortune. Catherine was wearing a demure dress and a look of practiced concern. Robert put his arm around my shoulders and guided me to my own armchair as if I were a fragile invalid. They didn't shout. They spoke in low, soothing tones, their words carefully chosen. Catherine worried about my well-being, suggesting I might be feeling isolated and not thinking clearly. Robert spoke of family unity and invoked his father's memory, insisting that George would have wanted them to be taken care of, that he would have wanted us all to be happy together. It was a masterful performance. They painted a picture of me as a confused, lonely old woman who had made a rash decision, and of themselves as the loving, forgiving children, ready to welcome me back into the fold if I would just undo this little mistake. I let them talk. I nodded and listened, watching the subtle interplay between them, the quick, confirming glances, the supportive touches on the arm. They thought they were building a cage of guilt and sentimentality around me. They had no idea the bars were made of smoke. When they had exhausted their script, I looked at them with what I hope was the perfect blend of weariness and consideration. I told them they had given me a lot to think about and that I needed some time. The relief on their faces was palpable. They saw my quietness not as strength, but as capitulation. They left my house with smug, triumphant smiles, convinced they had wrangled the old woman back into her pen. Robert patted my hand on his way out, telling me he knew I'd do the right thing. The moment the front door clicked shut, I walked to the window and watched their SUV disappear down the street. The mask of the docile, tractable grandmother fell away. I picked up the phone and dialed. David answered on the first ring. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I told him the wolves had just left and that their arrogance was even greater than we'd calculated. I said they thought they had won, which gave us the perfect quiet window to execute the final stage. I gave him the authorization. I told him to move the funds from the holding account and close the deal for the hospitality group. I specified that the purchase was to be made through the Numbered Shell Corporation, just as we'd planned. My name was to remain invisible until the very last moment. There was to be no ambiguity, no loophole, no retreat. The trap was now set. All I had to do was wait for the wolves to walk into it. I gave them 3 days of silence. I knew that for people like Robert and Catherine, who live in a world of instant gratification, 3 days without a resolution would feel like an eternity. Their smug satisfaction would have curdled into impatience, then anxiety, and finally into the kind of frustrated rage that leads to foolish decisions. They believed they were dealing with a simple old woman who held a small pot of gold. Their arrogance wouldn't allow them to imagine anything else, so when their emotional blackmail didn't yield an immediate result, they would inevitably resort to brute force. I was in my garden pruning the roses when my security consultant called to inform me that a low-level private investigator had begun making inquiries into my public records. It was a clumsy, noisy attempt, like a bear trying to pick a lock. They were looking for leverage for some hidden asset or embarrassing secret they could use to force my hand. I instructed my consultant to let him dig. I wanted them to find it. I wanted them to see the truth, not from my lips, but in the cold, hard print of a stranger's report. I can picture the scene so vividly. The investigator, a man probably used to tracking down cheating spouses, sitting in his drab office, his eyes getting wider and wider as he pulled on the threads. He would have started with simple property deeds and tax records, expecting to find my modest home. Instead, he would have found the shell corporations. He would have uncovered the LLCs that owned half a city block of prime commercial real estate. He would have followed the money from those leases to investment portfolios that dwarfed the family trust they held so dear. The final piece would have been the business journals from 2 decades ago, where an anonymous E. Vance was listed as the primary angel investor in a tech company that was now a household name. He wasn't investigating a retiree. He was uncovering a ghost, a titan who had been moving silently through the world for 30 years. I imagine his phone call to Robert was a memorable one. He likely sounded shaken, perhaps even a little frightened, like a man who had accidentally poked a sleeping dragon. I can see Robert and Catherine huddled around the phone, their impatience turning to shock, as the investigator explained that the woman they thought was a pauper was in fact one of the wealthiest individuals in the state. I can see them opening the file. He emailed their faces draining of all color as they scrolled through the evidence. Page after page, a cascade of revelations, each one a hammer blow to their entire worldview. The foundation of their lives, the belief in their own superiority, and my insignificance crumbled to dust in the space of a few minutes. In those circles of performative wealth, secrets have a short shelf life. News like that spreads like a virus. Maybe the investigator let it slip to a colleague over a beer. Maybe one of Catherine's friends had a connection who worked in city records. Or maybe, just maybe, my consultant David arranged for an anonymous tip to a certain society columnist. However it happened, the result was the same. Catherine's phone, once her scepter of social power, became a torture device. It would have started blowing up with texts dripping with the fake sympathy of her rivals, each message a thinly veiled attempt to confirm the rumor that the Vances were not patrons of the city, but dependents of the quiet old woman they had so openly disdained. Their world had been inverted. The source of their shame was now the source of all their power, and they had spent years spitting on it. The arrogance would have been burned away, replaced by a cold, stomach-churning terror. This was no longer about a frozen bank account. This was about their very survival, their identity, their place in the world. They were no longer dealing with a mother they could manipulate, but a force they could not comprehend. In their panic, they tried to call me. Of course they did. But the number to my old flip phone had been disconnected. My home line went unanswered. They were cut off adrift in a new and terrifying reality. Late that evening, as their panic surely reached its peak, a single text message arrived on Robert's phone from an unknown number. It contained no greeting and no signature, just an address, a date, and a time. It was an invitation to dinner, tomorrow night, at Orchid and Vine. I chose my armor for the evening with meticulous care. It wasn't a glittering gown or a string of pearls, but a charcoal gray suit tailored to perfection. The fabric was heavy, the lines were clean, and it settled on my shoulders with the comfortable weight of authority. This wasn't a party I was attending. It was a reckoning. It wasn't about anger anymore. Anger is a hot, messy emotion. This was about something colder, cleaner. This was about balancing the scales. I arrived at Orchid and Vine and paused in the entryway watching them from the shadows. They were already seated at the same table, the scene of their crime. They looked small and lost. The arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by a raw, twitching nervousness. They were picking at the bread, avoiding each other's eyes, their posture hunched in supplication. They had spent the last 24 hours contemplating the sheer scale of my hidden world, and it had clearly terrified them. They were here to beg. I watched as Robert began what was obviously a rehearsed apology, his voice low and cracking. I gave a subtle nod to a gentleman sitting alone at the bar. He stood, picked up his briefcase, and walked calmly to their table. He was a legal courier. He placed a thick document folder on the white tablecloth between them and stated their names for confirmation. I saw the confusion on their faces as they opened it. I watched as that confusion morphed into stark bone-white horror. They were reading the final notarized articles of dissolution for the Vance Family Trust. The last financial thread connecting us was being severed right there on the table, where they had dismissed me as a pauper. At that precise moment, as the reality of their financial ruin dawned, I stepped out of the shadows and into the main dining room. The manager, Michael, saw me instantly. His face broke into a broad, welcoming smile. He hurried past their table, his focus entirely on me. His voice was warm and loud, carrying through the hushed restaurant. He greeted me as Ms. Vance, the new owner, welcoming me to my establishment for the first time. A ripple of shock went through the nearby tables. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the local news crew. My advisor had tipped them off that the mysterious new owner of the city's largest hospitality group might be making an appearance. Their camera, which had been aimed at the general dining room, now swung to focus on the drama unfolding. My family's private downfall was now a public spectacle. I still hadn't looked at them. My attention was on Michael. I told him it was a pleasure to be there, but that there seemed to be a problem. I gestured vaguely towards the table. I said that it seemed some guests had been seated whose reservation was no longer valid. I instructed him, my voice even and clear, to make a permanent note in their system. Robert and Catherine Vance, I said, were to be permanently barred from this and every other establishment in my portfolio. I paused for a moment before adding that their presence unfortunately lowered the tone. That was what finally broke Catherine. She shot to her feet, sputtering my name, her face a crumpled mask of disbelief. She started to appeal to me as her mother, as family. Robert just sat there, a hollowed-out man, the legal papers still clutched in his hand. Only then did I finally turn and look at them. I let my gaze sweep over their shocked faces, my expression unreadable. I held the silence for a long moment, letting them feel the full weight of the room's attention. Then I spoke, my voice no louder than necessary, but it cut through the air like a shard of ice. I reminded them of what they had said right here at this very table. I told them they had wanted the pauper away from their table. My wish, I concluded, was to grant their request. Then I turned my back on them. I allowed Michael to lead me across the dining room to the best table in the house, the owner's table, which had been waiting for me all along. I didn't look back as the sounds of their complete and utter humiliation faded behind me. I didn't watch them leave the restaurant that night. I didn't need to. I had my dinner, a simple grilled fish, and it was the most delicious meal I had tasted in years. The storm had passed, and the silence it left behind was genuinely peaceful. The consequences of their actions were no longer my concern. They were simply a matter of cause and effect playing out in a world I had detached from. I heard about the aftermath, of course, through reports from my legal team. Their departure from the restaurant was just the beginning. The next day, the true financial winter began. With the trust dissolved and their accounts empty, the carefully constructed facade of their lives collapsed overnight. The bank holding the mortgage on their ostentatious house, a property they had leveraged to its absolute limit, initiated foreclosure proceedings. Their credit cards were canceled. I pictured them in that cavernous, empty house, surrounded by designer furniture they could no longer afford, packing their lives into cardboard boxes. I imagined the silence between them thick with blame and the shared bitter knowledge that they had done this to themselves. The social fallout was just as swift. The local news story of the restaurant titan and her ungrateful children became a piece of delicious gossip in the circles they so desperately wanted to command. They were ostracized not for their cruelty, but for their foolishness. In their world, being cruel is a forgivable sin. Being exposed as a fraud is not. Their phones stopped ringing. The invitations stopped coming. They had built their kingdom on the shifting sands of public opinion, and the tide had gone out, leaving them utterly stranded. My own life, in contrast, became quieter, but infinitely more full. I didn't move into a mansion or buy a fleet of luxury cars. I stayed in my small, comfortable home. But the money, which had been a silent, growing force for decades, was finally given a voice. I established the Vance Foundation for the Arts in memory of my George, who had loved painting. I found a struggling community center in a forgotten part of the city, its walls bare and its art supplies depleted. I met with the director, a tired but hopeful woman, and watched the children painting with watered-down colors on flimsy paper. The next week, new easels, canvases, and every color of paint imaginable arrived. I sat in the back of the room and watched their faces light up, and I felt a warmth that no amount of money could ever buy. This was my new legacy. A few months later, a letter arrived. I recognized Robert's handwriting immediately. It was thinner now, less confident. I opened it. It was several pages long, a rambling, desperate plea filled with hollow apologies and professions of a love he had never shown. He wrote of his regret, of his hardships, of how he had learned his lesson. At the end, he asked for help, a lifeline, a small allowance to get back on his feet. I read the letter from beginning to end, my expression unchanged. I felt no flicker of anger, no pang of pity. It was like reading a request from a stranger. The connection had been so thoroughly severed that his words could no longer reach me. He wasn't sorry for what he had done. He was sorry for what he had lost. I walked over to the small shredder I kept by my desk, the one I used for old bank statements. I fed the letter into the slot and listened to the quiet, satisfying whir as it turned his desperate words into meaningless strips of paper. The change was permanent. The ledger was closed. In the end, Eleanor's story teaches a powerful lesson about true worth. She learned that some people can only see a person's price tag, not their value. Her family saw her simple clothes and believed she was a pauper, treating her with a cruelty they thought was free of consequence. They never understood that dignity is the one thing you cannot buy, and respect is a debt that always comes due. They wanted the pauper away from their table, so she bought the entire table and left them with the bill. And that is what real justice looks like.